Hi everyone, thanks so much for listening to another episode of Dogman Encounters Radio. I'm Vic Cundiff and I'll be your host for the show. Before we bring on tonight's guest, if you've had a Dogman encounter and would like to speak with me about it, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you. If you've had a Sasquatch sighting and would like to be a guest on Bigfoot Eyewitness Radio, please go to bigfooteyewitness.com and submit a report. All right, let's bring on tonight's guest. Before we bring on tonight's guest, I want to remind all of you that next week marks the 300th episode of the show. As you know me, I'm not big on flash and fanfare and all that, but I guess to celebrate for this 300th episode, it's only fitting. With that in mind, we're going to welcome Josh Turner back on the show to tell us about a bunch of experiences that he's been collecting. And of course, we're going to be talking about his new show, Paranormal Roundtable, as well. Having said that, before we bring on tonight's guest, instead of bringing on an actual Dogman eyewitness, I figured it was time to kind of mix things up a little bit. To do that, instead of bringing on an eyewitness, we're going to bring on the grandson of an eyewitness. His name is Zack, and his grandfather's had several encounters with Dogman in Upper Peninsula Michigan. Zack, thanks so much for coming on.
No problem, Vic.
Zack, growing up, were you interested in horror movies and things that go bump in the night, or did they kind of put you off?
I'm a super big fan of horror, and especially reading it, like Stephen King and all that. I'm not a big fan of like magic and even stuff like werewolves. I wasn't into, because just the thought of like a man turning into a beast is like, I'm not really into witchcraft or magic. Like when I watch horror or read horror, I like it simple, and I just like it, kind of like, I'm a big fan of monster movies just because it's very simple. And it's one of the things I like about Dogman is that they just seem simple. Like it doesn't seem like there's too much magic or any of that sort. But yes, I'm a big horror buff.
You said you weren't into werewolves before your grandfather had his encounter. Were you even more put off by them after your grandfather had his first encounter?
Yeah, like I've always had an interest in Dogman and Bigfoot. So just because to me they're animals. They're kind of like wolves or deer. I don't really see the whole like witchcraft thing. Like I think it's possible, but I haven't watched it yet. And I know some of the people are probably going to shudder, but I haven't seen American Werewolf in London yet. And I'll probably be, since I'm in quarantine, I'll probably be watching that soon. But I was more fascinated by my grandfather's encounters just because I've always had an interest in that stuff. So when I actually did go back to Michigan to visit family and visit him, and he told me what happened to him and even some of his friends, which I'll be also telling their stories, it really more fascinated me. And it almost pushed me away from Hollywood movies because, Hollywood movies doesn't have nothing on the actual monster itself.
Zack, you've never seen an American Werewolf in London?
No, I've seen video clips and everything, but like I said, I've never been into the whole idea of a person or anything like that turning into a monster. But like I said, I'm more of a simple kind of horror buff. Like I love monster movies, but I like it simple. Like I just like having a creature. I love the mystique about just having a creature, and just kind of like, instead of having witchcraft and stuff, I like how people's emotion play out in them. Like just having a simple creature, but having all the complex stuff of, let's say, like magic and stuff like that, supernatural. Instead of having that, I like having people's emotions, that raw energy. So yeah, I haven't. I'm sorry, but I haven't seen it. I'll probably watch it here shortly. I've been thinking about it. So, but yeah.
Oh man, there's a lot of work to be done here. Yeah, I can see that now. That's okay. At least since you're in quarantine, you've got plenty of time to remedy that.
Oh yeah. No, like I've been watching a lot of movies because I'm up here alone in Alaska, so I've been watching a lot of movies, so I'm trying to keep myself busy. So that's just on a long list. That American Werewolf in London is on a long list of movies I haven't got to yet.
Oh, that's okay. When the time's right, yeah, I'm sure you will check it out. And when you do, you're going to wonder why you went so long without watching it. Yeah, that's a great movie.
I got that feeling too, Vic. I feel like as soon as I watch it, I'll be like, man, how come I haven't watched, this before? But it's been like that with tons of movies. So
Yeah, it is funny how that works out. Living in Michigan the way you were, had you heard about the Michigan Dogman before your grandfather had his first encounter?
yes, one of my favorite songs of all time is Steve Cook's "The Legend," and like that's what started it all. But I love the Sigma story too. I love those songs, and I've always been just mystified by it. Like my dad was stationed in Michigan from when I was in kindergarten to about second grade, third grade, and that's when I just was really mystified by Bigfoot. And then it was shortly after Bigfoot I discovered, oh, Michigan has its own, cryptid. And that's when I just fell in love with the mystique and everything about it. So yeah, the only field time I've ever gotten is like when I go out in the woods, like with my grandfather. I haven't done any big investigations or any research, like anything like that. But anytime I'm in the woods, I definitely look for signs or even signs that there's one around, even if the woods are super quiet or anything like that. So I'm definitely keeping my eyes open, but I wouldn't say I'm a big researcher by any means.
Well, a lot of people out there consider themselves and call themselves researchers who aren't actual researchers, but that's okay. It's good you understand the difference there. When your grandfather told you about his first encounter, what kinds of thoughts were going through your head? Did you believe him?
Oh yeah, no, I believe him. He's kind of like a second dad to me. And he's a role model, a best friend. He's not the type of guy that would make up stories or anything like that. He's a really honest man, very simple man. And he wasn't trying to tell the stories to scare me or nothing. I think the only reason why he did tell me the stories when I was at a young age is because he knew I could handle it. He's never heard of a dogman or anything like that prior to his experiences. He did know about Bigfoot. Of course, Bigfoot got big in the late 70s and whatnot. So he did know all about Bigfoot, and he's even been out west in Bigfoot country. He's never seen one or nothing like that, but he definitely knew that there was especially being out there. Like I think he was hunting out west, and he took a hunting trip with some buddies, and he definitely could see how one could live out there. But yeah, he's never he's never heard of a dogman, which I found it kind of strange that he pretty much lived in Michigan his whole life and never heard of the dogman. So but yeah, he told me because he knew I had an interest in Bigfoot. And the first time he told me, he did ask, he's like, hey, do you know what a dogman is? And I got really excited. I'm like, yeah, I know what a dogman is. And I started, telling him what it was and what's the difference between a Bigfoot and dogman. And then he was straight up like, yeah, I saw one. And it was only about 25 yards behind his house. And I knew exactly where it was anyway, but we walked back there and he walked me through it. And even some of his friends, he has quite a few friends that had experiences in that short time.
Wow, I'm so glad he was as open-minded as he is, because if he was closed-minded, it would have made dealing with his encounters that much more difficult. So, yeah, thank goodness for that. Well, Zack, before we talk about your grandfather's encounters, please tell us more about the man himself.
He's in his 60s. He's lived in Michigan his whole life. He lives in the Upper Peninsula Michigan right now. He's lived there since the late 70s, early 80s. He's a big woodsman. He spent more time outside than he has in a house or in a building. And even now, every day he's cutting wood. He's even teaching my cousins about hunting and even about nature itself, because he's not only a big hunter, but he also loves watching wildlife. Like when he baits for bear in the fall and spring, he'll take lawn chairs and we'll go out and sit probably 30 yards away from the bait pile and we'll watch bears. And of course, we have firearms with us and whatnot, but he just loves nature. Him and my grandmother love nature. And they just loved watching all forms of wildlife and all walks of life come through their backyard or wherever.
He sounds like a good man. I'm so glad you have him in your life, and I can only imagine all the great things that he's taught you over the years. That's great. All right, Zach, please tell us all about your grandfather's encounters now. Give us every last detail that comes to mind.
Okay. So he, of course, lives in the Upper Peninsula Michigan. If anyone is from Michigan, he lives about an hour, 2 hours west of Sault Ste. Marie. He, of course, big hunter, fisherman. He knows the woods pretty much like the back of his hand, and he's lived in the same house since the early 80s. And he has about 50 acres. He has trails going all through the woods. He loves taking walks through the woods. He knows the land like the back of his hand. It was probably 2012, I believe. He worked the night shift at his job. One night, it was in the fall time, I believe. He was getting up for work and he walked outside to get in his car and just leave. It was probably about 1 a.m. He was going to work the rest of the night and into the morning. And he heard like this breathing, and the woods were dead silent. Of course, during the fall time, they kind of are anyway, because all the birds and insects are gone. But, yeah, he walked out, started getting in his truck, and he heard this really heavy, raspy breathing. And it sounded very like deep. He described it like as if like a weightlifter just like ran like full sprint for miles. And he just found it kind of odd because he's never heard, like he's heard, tons of animals, and he's even heard animals breathing heavy from like running and all that stuff. Because sometimes when my dad and him would go hunting, they would set their blinds apart just right. So if one of them missed the shot, the deer would run right to the other blind. So he's heard, deer after they got done running and stuff. And he never heard anything like this. It was just really deep, really low, kind of raspy, but very loud. And he actually went back inside. Like he sat there, listened to it for a while. And this went on for about a couple minutes. He said it sounded pretty close. Like he said it was probably back by some of his barns. Like he has a sawmill barn and stuff like that. So it was probably about maybe 50 to 100 yards, but it was so loud that he thinks that it was probably even closer. But he went back inside, and he even got my grandmother and was like, "Hey, you gotta come listen to this," because he was so like mystified by it that even he like couldn't kind of grasp the sound that he's never heard before. So he went and got my grandmother, and they sat there and they listened to it for a good probably 5 to 10 minutes. And it was just really heavy breathing. And they didn't feel like they were being watched or anything, but he probably thought that it probably was watching them. And this went on for about 5-10 minutes. And then finally they just kind of, after kind of whispering and talking about it, they kind of carried on with their day. And he just thought, hey, maybe it was like a big animal, or because they do have a lot of coyotes and wolves can get pretty big. So he just thought, hey, maybe it's a bear that hasn't went into hibernation yet. So my grandmother went back inside, and he went in his truck, and they just carried on with their day. So that was the first encounter. Now I say encounter, but he didn't see nothing. All he heard something, but it kind of after I tell the rest of the encounters, it kind of points towards the Dogman, because it was only within a short span. It was between the fall of, I think it was 2012 and the summer of 2013. So it was a very short span, but quite a few things happened. So he thinks it was a Dogman just because of what the next few encounters I'm going to tell are. It kind of points to it, but that was kind of just the start of it. So the second encounter, it was shortly after what my grandfather heard, I believe. I don't think it was the same month. I think it was next month. But anyway, so my grandfather, he's lived in the town, since the late 70s, early 80s. He's helped a lot of people in the town. They help him. It's a very small and desolate town. And I don't want to say the name of the town, just for confidentiality. But if I named the name of the town and you went and looked it up, you would be like, oh wow, someone lives there. Like it's very remote. Everyone knows everyone. One of his friends from town came up because my grandfather's property, how it's laid out, he owns about 50 acres. And then all around that is just nothing but forests and swamps and state owned land. There are trails that go through it and whatnot, but it's nothing but state owned land, and it's very dense woods, very swampy. If anyone has been to the Upper Peninsula Michigan, they would, at least the eastern portion of it, they would definitely understand. So across the road, it's a dirt road, is all state land. He owns nothing on that side, but he has a lot of tree stands and blinds, and he lets some of his friends use them and go, and he tells some of his close friends some of his hunting spots and stuff like that. So it was around the same time as my grandfather's breathing encounter, I guess we'll call it. And it was late at night. He sat in a tree blind, I believe, all day, and he didn't see nothing. And it was pitch black out, not a single sound. It's super dead silent. It was kind of cold out, so he kind of bundled up. He went back outside and started going back to his quad, which was probably about half mile to a mile away. And it's just this little, just wide enough for a quad, this little trail just headed back there. So he just started headed back. It was pitch black out. It's probably 11 o'clock at night. And he just was walking. The leaves were really crunchy, so every step could be heard for probably a mile, like super dead quiet. So he was walking and he thought he heard something behind him. So he stops, and he did have a flashlight. So he turned around, he did a scan, and there's nothing, and there's no more further steps. So he thought, okay, maybe it's just a animal passing by or whatnot. And the footsteps were no louder than his. So he couldn't judge size or anything like that, because anyone who steps on that, it would make the same cracking leaf sound, because they were pretty much frozen at this point to the ground. And he started walking again, and a few moments later he heard it, whatever was behind him, walking too. So he stopped. He would shine his flashlight. Nothing. Like he had good visibility, and there was nothing. And it sounded like it was right behind him, but there was nothing there. So he's kind of like, okay, like he thought maybe he was just getting stalked by, let's say like a coyote or wolf or something like that. And which, that honestly, that happens a lot up there. My grandfather, he's had coyotes kind of not come after him, but definitely kind of keep their distance and stalk him. My mom, she's had experiences where coyotes, they would like form one big circle around them and just kind of stalk him as if like waiting for the right chance. So he thought maybe it was just maybe a lone coyote or a wolf just stalking him, because there aren't things like mountain lions or nothing like that. So he just figured, okay, it's probably just a lone coyote or wolf, whatnot. So he didn't hear no breathing, he didn't hear nothing. All he heard were the footsteps. So, but every time he would walk, it would walk. And every time he stopped, it would take one more step and then stop. This went on the whole entire time. Like it must have felt like eternity for the guy, because like I said, his quad was about half a mile to a mile, and every 5 to 10 steps he was stopping and trying to see what this was. So finally, after, probably an hour or so of just being trailed by something that had the smarts to stop every time he stopped, he finally saw his quad in the distance with the flashlight. And he was like, okay, he was kind of like rattled at this point. Like I said, he thought it was a coyote or whatnot. So he just, again, he didn't pick up the pace or nothing. Just every 5 to 10 steps, he would stop, turn around, nothing there. And it would always take one more step after him. He did that up until he was probably within maybe 30 yards away from his quad, when all of a sudden he stopped, and whatever was stalking him this whole time, let out the most ungodly roar. He said that it thundered in his chest. Like it literally like made his heart skip a beat. It was super loud, really just like he didn't describe it as like, let's say a werewolf howl. It was more of kind of like a roar. He described it. And it sounded very just deep chested, very big. He didn't say whether it was raspy or even how far away he thought it was, because it was pitch quiet out. So it literally could have been even like half a mile away for all he knew. But he said it sounded like it was right behind him, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. After that, he turned around one more time, just in case this thing was like running or whatnot at him. So he turned around one more time, double checked that there was nothing, and he hightailed it to the quad. And in Michigan, you have to you can't have your firearm loaded or anything like that when riding a quad or any vehicle. And he did not care at this point. He hopped on the quad, started it, and went zooming out of there. And he never looked back. He zoomed right out of there, and it really kind of terrified the guy. Like I think the guy stopped hunting for a bit and going out in the woods just because of how terrifying it was, because it sounded like it was right behind him with how loud it was. And it was just very ear piercing, just very, very loud. But like it wasn't a howl. He said it was more of a roar. So it was just a very, very scary thing, especially after it being so quiet and just being stalked by whatever it was for that whole entire time. So it definitely startled him. And my grandfather, because he wasn't there, so he didn't really think of anything else other than maybe it was the same thing that he heard, or maybe it was a bear or whatnot, which bears should be in hibernation, but maybe this one just happened to be out of hibernation. But it definitely startled the guy. And my grandfather, when he heard about it, he kind of took notes and kind of kept it in the back of his head, but my grandfather still went out in the woods, wasn't, even with what he heard, he wasn't scared or nothing, because the way he looks at it is just one of God's creatures. So my grandfather just thought, okay, maybe it was a bear or even a giant wolf. Like maybe since it was just so quiet out before, maybe just the sudden abrupt sound of the animal just made it sound louder. Because this happened, a couple miles from my grandfather's property, right across the road. So it definitely, it's definitely kind of weird for sure. Now, my grandfather's third encounter, he didn't personally have an encounter, but it happened right in his backyard, and it happened to some friends of his. These were different friends than the last encounter, but like I said, he has a lot of friends. But these friends were from downstate, I think Lansing area, and they would always come up. They came up probably 3 times a year to hunt. My grandfather knew him for years. They were best buddies. And he's a really good guy too. He's a lot like my grandfather. They were always hunting. They have tons of stories together. They could go on for days about how much hunting they've done together. What shenanigans they've gotten into. They've really known each other for a long time. So there's a blind right behind my grandfather's house. It's down in a swamp, so you can't see it, but it's probably, quarter mile, half mile away from the house, and it's down in a swamp. Like I just walked back there last summer, and it's just very, very dense, very swampy. Like you can't walk back there with tennis shoes because you would just be flooded. And the blind itself I've always kind of been eerie by it. Even before all this stuff was taking place, it's always had an eerie thing to it, because it was a very old blind, and it was almost like a time machine. Like there would be like Pepsi bottles from the 80s in there. It wasn't like my grandfather never kept it up or anything, because he kind of built it just to have a second spot, because he has his main blind, which he's had, for decades. And that's his pristine, he hand built it. He has a wood stove in there. So the second blind was kind of just just to see if down in the swamp there would be any deer or anything like that. And I think he shot deer out of it, but it really wasn't, like I said, like there was rappers in there from like the 80s and 90s. So as a kid, it was kind of like a time machine. But so he had some friends come up from Lansing area, and they were sitting down there, and they sat down there for I think a few days, just seeing if they could see anything. And they didn't see no deer. They were hunting, so they didn't see no deer or anything. And so, they finally, before, it was going to be their last day, they're like, hey, we'll just target shoot. In the woods were really silent. And of course, this is the spring after my grandfather's and the other guy's encounter. So this was the spring after, and the woods were just really dead silent, and just, it was a nice day out. So, visibility wasn't an option or anything. Of course, down there it's dark anyways, but that was probably as light as it could get. But anyway, they're like, hey, let's just target shoot. Because they obviously wanted to shoot their guns, but they didn't see no deer to shoot at. So they're like, hey, let's just start target shooting. So they, they're like, okay, and it was their last day. So they're like, gonna find stuff to hit, and they got all ready. And then they fired the first shot, and in that direction, they heard a roar. They didn't describe it as a howl. They described it more as like a roar, as if they hit a bear or whatnot, and it's kind of like the last guy's encounter, just very deep. Like you could tell it was just had a really good set of lungs on him. And it was very deep, very dense, just very loud. Like, the hair stood up on the back of their neck, and they thought they hit, like, they didn't know what they hit. Like they thought maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was, it just sounded very angry, and it just had a lot of unnerving to it. So they took a pause to see if they could hear something, because if they hit an animal, it would probably be running through the woods and causing a ruckus. And they didn't hear nothing. It was just dead quiet. So then they're like, okay, maybe obviously we didn't hit nothing, because it, nothing ran. And I think they were kind of too scared, just in case they did hit something and it died on the spot. I think they were kind of too scared to go check it out, to be honest, because of just how angry and just almost annoyed it sounded. So they gave it a few seconds, didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, didn't smell anything. So they're like, okay, they're like, okay, let's just continue on. Maybe whatever was there maybe left or whatnot. So, or maybe it was just, maybe it was a noise from the house. Like maybe my grandfather started up a truck or whatever. Like they were just, trying to find something. And so they're like, okay, let's just continue target shooting, but let's find a different spot, because just in case, they didn't want to hit the same thing or come close to hitting the same thing. So they swayed the barrel over, and they're like, oh, okay, let's, keep doing. So then the second shot, the same exact noise after, just very loud, dense, very just bone rattling. And it sounded as if it was right in the blind with them. And it was just one solid, almost like roar, just one solid, like they didn't hear anything, didn't see anything afterwards, just one solid, as if it was like annoyed that they were shooting. So, they gave it a few seconds again and was like, okay, this is kind of weird, because now they don't know what it is. Like at first, like, okay, could have been maybe a bear or whatnot, but now they don't know what it is, because they know they didn't hit nothing now. So they, now they don't know what it is, and they're like, okay, let's just, give it a few seconds. Nothing happened. And now they were still, I think, scared, but now they were more curious. So then they're like, okay, let's just fire off a few more shots and just see if this thing keeps making this noise, and maybe we can pinpoint what it is or where it's at. So they fired a few more shots, and after each shot, the same noise. And it was so loud that it literally like, it could have rattled the blind. Like it was just very loud, very, very bone rattling, just very deep. Again, it was more of a roar than a howl, which I kind of found weird, but, it was almost as if it was annoyed that they were shooting and making all this ruckus. So they, after a couple more shots, they were like, okay, let's just get out of here. Cause they, that's when they're like, okay, we're not hitting anything by accident. We're not, let's just get out of here. Cause obviously whatever's, even further away in the swamp, whatever's out there doesn't want them. So they got out of there and they told my grandfather, and my grandfather, he put in the back of his mind, but he didn't think too much of it and he didn't hear it. I think he was up by the house and he might have been in the house, but he didn't hear it because they straight up asked, they're like, did you hear that? And he was like, hear what? So I'm thinking he might have been in the house, but, they're a little bit rattled. They're big bear hunters. So they weren't too rattled, but it is definitely bizarre because they've been coming up for years and years, for decades, and they never heard anything like that. So it's just is kind of very odd. And it kind of sets up for the next and final encounter. Shortly after that, it was in the same season, maybe even summer. So all spring and summer long, my grandfather described, he has some apple trees out in his, it's only a small collection of apple trees out by his yard. And then behind the apple trees is a giant hill. And it's almost like a cliff, like it cuts off and you look down and it's a very dense swamp. There's creeks, natural spring creeks that run all through the property, and a lot of them come from that location. Shortly after his friend's experiences, it was like spring or summer. He would describe like coming home from work or from the store, and when he pulled in his driveway, he would see eye shine, stuff like that, which honestly, that's nothing because he sees that pretty much every day anyway. But I think he did find some prints. He described them as like wolf prints that were huge, that were way too big for a wolf. So, and again, he doesn't frighten easy. He just thinks, okay, maybe it's a big wolf around that just came into the area and might stick around forever, however long. So he figured it was just a really big wolf because he's never heard of Dogman or cryptids. Like he's heard of Bigfoot, but obviously this wasn't a Bigfoot. So, I think he found some prints. He would see eye shine, shadows. Which the eye shine and shadows, that's just common anyway. That's an everyday occurrence up there. But, he there was just, little things like that. And then finally he encountered it. So it was in the spring and summer. He has a floodlight about 25 yards behind his house because him and my grandmother, they love watching animals. They love bird watching. They love, especially during, bear and deer season. They love watching because bears would come every night, and they would always turn on the floodlight. And it was away from his house, so it'd be like his house, and then it'd be like 20 yards of just pitch blackness, and then finally the floodlight was up on almost like a 2x4, and it would shine over a little portion of a swamp, and it would shine behind his pole barns and stuff like that. And all the time there would be bears down there, coyotes, wolves. He's seen, sometimes him and my grandmother would just leave the floodlight on, and even animals would just walk underneath the floodlight, like deer and stuff. Like it's, there's a lot of animals, and there's not a lot of trees in the visibility way. Like in the wintertime, he put leftover scraps, like carrots and stuff like that, out for the deer. He would put that closer to the house, but he would always see deer just like living in that area. So, it was about 25 yards, and his house is kind of on a hill, so it kind of overlooked it. And every time he walks past the window, he would flick on the light switch and see if there's anything down there, and if there's bears, he would watch them. If, he's seen wolves, like wolves are, I wouldn't say rare, but they're definitely, if you see one, it's like, oh wow, I just saw a wolf. And the DNR is very highly protective of them. So that's why, like, coyote hunting, you got to use a scope, because if you accidentally shoot a wolf, it's going to be bad news for you. So they would try and look for wolves and coyotes, deer, even stuff like different birds, because they would have guides, like different bird watching guides and stuff to distinguish between the birds. So they just loved seeing what was down there, and there's a bird feeder and whatnot. And that was up closer to the house, but you know, he just loved watching animals. So this one night, he didn't work that night, but since he worked every other night, he was always up every night. So every time he had to go to the bathroom or even just to walk around, stretch his legs, he would turn on that floodlight and just, you know, see what was down there. And, you know, I think earlier he saw like a couple raccoons, stuff like that. So nothing too crazy. And, you know, and he's done this for decades. So he just flips on the light and, you know, he just sees what's down there and turns it off and doesn't think anything of it. It's almost been kind of like a very integrated into his life. So it was in the wee hours of the morning, you know, pitch black out, summertime. And, you know, he would walk over, flick on the light, nothing. So finally, just this one time, he was like, you know, he got up to use the bathroom or whatnot, and he went to go flick on the light. And up near his pole barns, he saw something there, you know, and this happened within a span of 20 seconds. This whole encounter is probably 10 to 20 seconds, but he saw, as soon as he flicked on the light, within its grasp of the light, he saw something standing there as if it was looking into his, cause he always leaves his sawmill barn open and stuff like that. Cause up in the UP, you don't really have to worry about people stealing, or cause there's really no one to steal your stuff. So, he flicked on the light and there was just this thing standing there, just within the faint glow of the light. It was in the outer reaches of the floodlight, and it was near up his sawmill barn. And he told me that if it ran into a sawmill barn or ran away, he would have just taken it as a deer. But instead, when he flipped on the light, he saw it standing there for a few seconds, and then it turned around, ran on two legs, and then ran underneath the light. And then right after the floodlight, it transitioned down to all fours and then ran off into the woods. And, you know, he was bewildered. He described it as tan. It was very tan. Like, as I said, if it just ran into the sawmill barn or whatnot, he would have taken it as a deer, because it kind of had the same color, but it was tan, very large. Like, up near the sawmill barn, it didn't look big, but when it started running, now my grandfather is about 6'3", 6'5". He's a really big dude. He worked in the prisons and all that. So he was a very, very big dude. And he described this thing as bigger than him. And it's just very kind of stocky. And he described it as its hair. He said its hair was kind of, it was not long, but it wasn't short. He described it as kind of being between like a deer and a coyote. Like, it kind of had some scruffiness to it, but it didn't look like it had a lot of hair. So it ran on two legs, and he could see paws. It ran on two paws, and it had big hands. It wasn't paws, it was big hands. And I think it wasn't a type 3, because he said it had more of the canine dog leg. And he almost described it as, when it got on all fours, the leg kind of almost looked like a kangaroo leg. Like, just very odd. And of course it had the pointed ears, canine head, and it ran on two legs for, a good probably 10, 15 yards. Just, it dashed on two legs. And then finally, after it cleared the floodlight, and it was going sideways. So, the floodlight, it ran right underneath the floodlight. And after the floodlight, it just transitioned down to all fours, and it was gone. And he stood there, and, he didn't get too, like, of course he was a little bit startled, but he wasn't scared or nothing. And he remembers thinking like, what did I just see? Like, cause he's been in the woods, since he was like 3 or 4 years old, and he would be the type of guy that would skip school to go hunting. Like I said, he's been in the woods more than he's been underneath a roof. So after seeing that, he had no clue what he just saw. He's almost like, I wouldn't say shocked, but he just kind of was like, what in the world was that? Like, he was not expecting it, to see anything. Cause the whole night he just saw, raccoons or nothing, so he was not expecting to see something, let alone this thing. And he didn't know what it was. Like, he started thinking, he's like, is it a wolf? Was it just maybe like a mutated wolf? Was it a cross between different animals? Like, was it maybe a wolf and a deer? Like, he didn't know what on earth it was. And what really got him was its color. Like, it just had a really weird tan color. And then obviously it ran on two legs and whatnot. And, his mind was racing. And then so he just shut off the light and was like, okay, and carried on with his night. And then, next morning he told my grandmother. And of course my grandmother was a little startled, because she would walk up and down that dirt road by herself. Like, she would always go for walks and whatnot. And, she would always take walks up and down that dirt road by herself. And there's only a handful of houses on the whole dirt road. They're the last house on the dirt road. And the dirt road's about, a couple miles long. But after their house, it's about, half a mile to a mile of just swamp and wood. So, she was a little startled, but, then again, they just took it as it's, one of God's creatures. And my grandfather, described it as, God lifting up the veil a little bit to let him see something that not a lot of people get to see. So he's seen ghosts, he's seen aliens, even being out in the woods, he's seen some bizarre stuff, just like orbs of light, stuff like that. He's not frightened. Cause everything in this world is, for him to see and whatnot. So for him to enjoy. So he wasn't frightened or nothing. Like, as a kid, he saw UFOs and whatnot, because there's a lot of farm fields where he grew up. So he actually walked out of his house one time as a kid, and there across the street there was a big field, and there was a small, like, silver, what he described as like a little flying saucer sitting there. And at first he thought, like, well, that's some weird farm equipment. And then he went and got his mom, and his mom, came out and thought it was kind of odd, and she just went back inside. Like, they just thought, okay, maybe it was just some, back in that time, it would have been new space age, farm equipment or something like that. So they didn't really think too much of it. And then he said that he watched it, and he's like, well, I want to know what it is. So he started walking closer, and it levitated up into the sky and just flew away. So he's seen all kinds of weird stuff. So, he didn't know what it was. He thought maybe it was just some weird wolf, something like that. But, yeah. And then, so it was probably a few months later, he was down at my one uncle's house. He lives about an hour and a half southeast of my grandfather. And my grandfather started telling him, like, they just got on the subject of talking about like wolves or dogs or something. And my grandfather was like, hey, I saw this giant dog that like ran on two legs. And my uncle, like, I guess my grandfather was expecting him to be like kind of mystified, but then my uncle was instantly like, oh, what is it? And so my grandfather started telling him, what I just told you guys. And my uncle was instantly like, holy crap, you saw a Dogman. And my grandfather was like, what in the world is that? Like, my grandfather, he's never heard of the Dogman, or like he knew, of course, what werewolves were and stuff like that, but he didn't know a Dogman existed, let alone, walked underneath his floodlight. So my uncle went on the computer and started showing him pictures or, drawings, stuff of what people saw. And my grandfather was like, yeah, that's it. That's what I saw. And yeah, it was just very, very odd, because after that, there was in the area, there was no more sightings. Like, he didn't see no more footprints, no more even the weird eye shine and just shadows, like, of course there would always be eye shine and shadows, but he thinks that maybe it was, probably watching him, because he would be out in the woods 24/7, out in his lawn, gardening, chopping wood, whatever. So he thinks that maybe this whole time it was just watching him, but it's just odd because he never has seen anything, even up to this day, never seen anything like it. So, and even some of his friends in town and stuff haven't seen anything. So it's just weird that it just kind of almost passed through the area just for that brief time, for the brief 8 months to a year time. It just kind of passed through. And that's what he thinks it was. And that's what I kind of think it is too, that maybe it was just passing through, or maybe it wanted to live there. But since it was uncovered or seen, so it's just very odd. And yeah, my grandfather, he would tell me these stories, because my dad was in the military and I'm also in the military, but I was a military brat. So I've lived primarily East Coast, but I've lived all over the place. And about every summer and Christmas, about once or twice a year, we try and go back to Michigan to visit family, because all our family lives in Michigan. My mom and dad, they grew up in Michigan, and it's northern Michigan. So, they grew up in northern Michigan, and all our family lives in northern Michigan. Like, they're all within, about 4-hour drive from one another. So yeah, and every time I'd go there, we'd always have bonfires, or, even just sit in the living room, and I'd always ask him to tell a story every time, because it was, it's just it's so awesome. And, of course, I was in high school at the time. So of course I was like, oh, I want to see one, so I would go in the woods at night. And this was only a few years after the fact. So, I would go out in the woods and be like, maybe he'll come back, and I even, tried spending the night in his deer blind the one time, just to see if I can see it. And of course, during the summer, the mosquitoes got so terrible that I couldn't do it. So I just, walked back. But of course, now I wouldn't do that. I would not go looking for one. And he stands by it. He's a very honest guy, and he'll tell people if the topic comes up. He'll tell people what he saw, and he doesn't try and make it a extravagant thing for fame or nothing. He just tells it. It's kind of like a campfire story that actually happened. And then it's also funny because he had some friends come and visit, and he rents out a cabin. Not anymore, but they used to rent out a cabin, to anyone who wants to stay up in the UP, because it is a, very nice area, and the cabin is only a short distance away from his house. So he would all the time get snowmobilers, hunters. He would even have people on their honeymoon come up there. Like, I don't know why you would want to go up there for your honeymoon. Like, it's very beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it's just, it's very swampy. Just, it's no Italy or nothing, but so yeah, so he had some friends stay up in the cabin, and he told his friend what he saw, and his one friend was petrified. Like, his one friend was even considering not even staying there. For some reason, his one friend just really got afraid. And so as a joke, my grandfather, he had a coyote skin and a coyote pelt. It was almost like kind of like a bear rug, but instead it was a coyote rug. And he used to always chase us around with it as kids, but he actually stuck it on a broom handle, and in the middle of the night, he went out there, and this is years after his encounter, and he's figured the creature wasn't even close to where he was anymore. But, he went out there in the middle of the night, and the cabin was a short distance. Like, you can see it from his house. So he went out there, and the dude was just sitting on the chair in there watching movies or whatnot. And, he kind of stuck the coyote head underneath the window frame and slowly raised it up just enough so you could see the head. And he said that dude jumped out of his seat, and there's a small little attic, and he said that he ran up to the attic and hid there for the rest of the night. And the next morning his friend was like, I saw him. And my grandfather, of course, was playing along and was like, what do you mean you saw it? And he's like, I saw the Dogman. And to this day my grandfather hasn't told him the truth. But yeah, it's just they take it as a blessing what happened to him. That, like I said, it's kind of just God lifting the veil and just letting them see something. I wouldn't say supernatural, but just, something that a lot of people don't have the privilege to see. So, yeah, they haven't seen it since. No one's reported it. So I don't know where it, ran off to, but, yeah, some of the stories I wanted to share with you guys.
That was pretty dirty. Scaring that poor guy like that, that's rough.
Yeah, my grandfather, he's a very honest man, but once in a while, he does love a good joke. So he will, like as a kid, he used to chase us around the house with that because it's not frightening, but it looks like a coyote. So he used to just pick up the little coyote rug and kind of play tag up with us. And, so yeah, I don't know where he got the idea because even for him, that's kind of, that is a pretty dirty joke, but, he did like teasing people a little bit. And this guy was kind of afraid of the woods anyway. So my grandfather was like, oh, he's a sissy anyway, so so I don't know where he got the idea, but I'm sure my grandmother didn't approve, but it was funny. I wish I could have been there to see it because it would have been hysterical to see the guy's face.
Yeah, that was pretty dirty. No doubt about that. Considering the fact that his encounters all happened when you were a kid, how sick did he get of telling you about them?
Oh, he never got sick because, he wouldn't use it to scare people. He wouldn't add on to it or subtract from it. He would kind of just tell it as it is. And as a kid, I loved hearing it. So, and he knew, the only reason why he told me, I was probably, 13, 14 at the time. And, he told me because he knew I was into Bigfoots. And at that time, he knew it was a Dogman. I think he was just seeing if I knew what it was. And as soon as I knew what it was, and, he loved telling it. He's a big storyteller to begin with. Like he's had a lot of cool experiences, like, taking hunting trips out west or even, he has tons of hunting stories. Like he's shot tons of deer and he has a story for each one of them. And my poor grandmother, even some of them include her having to get up in the middle of the night and helping him track it or even carry it up to the house. So he has a lot of good experiences. And this was kind of just an experience in a long list of good life.
It sure sounds to me like he has lived a good life. Well, Zach, I want to thank you so much for coming on and telling us about all those experiences he had. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, Vic. And I'm a big fan. I'm an avid listener. So, I enjoy sharing them and letting people enjoy them.
Well, it's been great having you on and listening to you do that. Thanks again so much. Have a great night. If you've had a Dogman encounter of your own and would like to speak with me, whether in private or on the show, please go to dogmanencounters.com and submit a report. I'd love to hear from you.